Welcome back to part 3 of Newton's laws of motion. So we talked about on the first video on inertia and the second video on force. If you haven't seen those, pause, go check them out, and then come back here to our third video that deals with action and reaction, the third law of motion. In other words, that reads as, for every force exerted on an object, the second object exerts an equal and opposite on the first. You've probably more commonly heard of this as, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And we'll get right into it using GTA 5 and crashing cars as an example. We hit a car, we're driving, we hit it, we're exerting a force on them, and at the same time, they are exerting an equal and opposite force on us. And that's why in this picture, you see that both cars basically look like they're doing the same motion. There's an equal and opposite force from both cars that are happening with this collision. And we can go through crash after crash after crash. They all look a little different, but the main thing you'll notice is if there was no equal and opposite force, the car we're driving would just keep going straight, no damage, nothing would happen to them. They would just exert that same force and hit and damage the car in front of them. But that's not the case. Every crash we see, our car gets messed up too. It gets moved, it gets flown, it gets spun out, damaged, it gets stopped in its tracks. That's the opposite force from the second object acting on us. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We see that on every single car crash. Now, there are also other ways that we can illustrate this. The simplest example is a car sitting on the ground. It has a weight, which is a force acting down on the ground, and the equal and opposite force of that is the ground is pushing up on the car. Because if that equal and opposite force of the ground didn't exist, the car would just sink. But it's not. It's staying still on the ground. And lastly, we're going to look at a plane because really, I'm an airplane nerd, so let's do it. Now, last video we talked about how an engine is exerting a force, which is what causes a plane to fly, but really this also plays into the third law for an equal and opposite force. The engine does this by pulling in air from the front, igniting it, and pushing out the hot gases backwards. And this causes a thrust force forwards, which is what propels a plane moving forward. It's the equal and opposite reaction of the air being pushed out the back of the engine. Simple. And we did it. We used GTA 5 to really help us understand the concepts of Newton's 3 laws of motion, where the first one is inertia. An object in motion or an object at rest stays in that same state unless acted upon by a force. And the second law is the acceleration depends on the mass and the force applied of an object. And the third, action and reaction, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, which is what we just went over in this video. So these are 3 very basic laws of motion which really Newton came up with, and they can explain most things that you see in physical life. So I hope you liked it. I hope this helped a little bit to understand them a little bit better. If you really liked it, hit subscribe. I'm going to have more series, more videos coming out with all kinds of different subjects, all kinds of different games. I'd love to have you back. So subscribe, like, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.